Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks with me, Mega of Mayaani Jewellery. Now, those of you who are familiar with this space will already notice the difference in the screen behind me, which was not present before. Small changes are underway. I have been tidying my studio space and I also plan to paint these sides, which desperately need attending to. So there'll be more changes to come, but essentially, this is a beautiful space. Welcome if you're new here, in which I share with you my journey into becoming more conscious when it comes to my jewelry choices and why I feel that is important. And it's also um, in this space an opportunity for us to question whether we are happy with the way that luxury jewelry sort of sits in our lives at present, whether we agree with what luxury jewelry stands for at the moment in this present time that we live in, and whether we feel we want a change when it comes to luxury jewelry for whatever reason. Essentially for me, as I have gone along this journey and process of looking into why jewelry needs to be deeply meaningful and why it needs to be much more than it already is when it comes to luxury jewelry, I have uncovered so much I was not consciously aware of when it came to my jewelry choices, which but in the process become more conscious when it comes to not just my jewelry choices but life choices in general, because I, for one, for example, was not particularly sustainability minded or focused before I had children, but having had children in particular and thinking to the future generation, not just my children themselves, but all future generations of all families and people who have children or loved ones who are going to be carrying on the family legacy, essentially. Thinking about what sort of future we'll leave them behind with. So essentially, this idea of being more sustainable and more conscious in our jewelry choices is something that stems from my own personal changes in my personal life. So, without going into that anymore, I thought today I'd share with you what this particular video is about. So, I have been sharing with you the traditions when it comes to jewelry across the globe. And we have looked into the jewelry traditions across Africa, jewelry traditions across the indigenous communities of North America. And so now I thought, let's have a little look at the jewelry traditions which existed across Europe before the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's important to mention that because if you've heard it before, you're going to hear it again. The Industrial Revolution was a pivotal point for us as humans in many ways, which we won't go into here. But when it comes to jewelry, it was a very key moment when a shift happened from jewelry being handmade to now being machine made, from jewelry being slow made, very few pieces being something that was in some senses rare, and also for that reason, because it was rarer, perhaps more deeply meaningful to us. We wanted to have a piece. We might only have one piece in our lifetime, so let's make it one that really communicates us as a person. Into we can make lots of these pieces of jewelry. You don't have to, worry about how many you're going to have anymore. They don't have to be deeply personal or connected to you in any way. We just buy them because they're pretty. That was one big shift that the Industrial Revolution brought about, but equally, globally speaking, Industrial Revolution signaled a huge shift in our thinking away from luxury being associated with artistry, with skill, with the duration of time that went into creating something, with the storytelling that went into it, with the heritage it carried, across to now looking at luxury jewelry more from the point of view of what is this made of. So essentially, we started looking at luxury jewelry as made of only specific materials like gold, precious metals, and precious gemstones after the Industrial Revolution. Before that period of time, the material was less important. And yes, it is important to a degree when it comes to heirloom pieces, but that's not to say that just because we stopped looking at gold, just because we were looking at luxury jewelry from a point of view of other materials, that those were any less long lasting than gold or silver or precious gemstones are, for example. So that's the reason why I looked into European jewelry traditions which existed before the Industrial Revolution, and I found out some fascinating things which I'll share with you now. Of course, there are always 5 facts. In this case, the facts are not always facts as such. Sometimes they're food for thought. In this particular video, they are facts. I'm looking at different regions across Europe in each of these 5. So the first of these particular facts, I thought we'd look at Celtic jewelry traditions, which were the jewelry traditions of the people of the British Isles and Western Europe as well, parts of Western Europe. And essentially, when it comes to Celtic jewelry traditions, there were a few key pieces of jewelry that you may be familiar with. I was not familiar with all of these. I'm familiar with Celtic knotwork, for example. The Celtic knot is a very beautiful symbol which has a sort of unbroken line line. And the whole beauty of the unbroken line is it shows the interconnected, the infinite interconnectedness of things. And this Celtic knot symbol is typically found in a lot of wedding bands, for example, where essentially it shows the unending, never ending bond that exists between two people, the two people who are united through marriage. But alongside the Celtic knotwork, there's also the tradition of wearing torques. Now, torques were metal rings that were worn by nobility and warriors alike. And essentially, torques were actually passed down by chieftains when it came to warriors. And they were passed down by the chieftain to the warrior as a symbol of the bond which exists or existed between the chieftain and that warrior. So they weren't just a here's a trophy for all the hard work you've done, or here's a trophy because you're my number one warrior. It was not that at all. In actual fact, this receiving of a torque was a huge honor because what you now carried was a symbol of the bond, the unending bond that exists between you and the chief that you serve from the warrior's point of view. And from the chief's point of view, it's the chief swearing an oath to this warrior and vice versa to remain bonded and bound to that warrior and vice versa. So they were very, very powerful symbols. So essentially, when it came to Celtic jewelry, the jewelry was not just something for decoration, of course, it was a form of protection. It communicated your beliefs, so there was spirituality involved, and it told anyone from the one glance where you're from, what you believe in, and who you are as well. And of course, not forgetting that when it came to the Celtic knot, it also communicated the bond that exists, and so did the torque rings, the bonds that exist between people as well. Now, fact number two, going on to looking at Scandinavian and Norse jewelry traditions, and when it came to these, there are a few particularly popular ones which you may be aware of. Thor's hammer pendants, for example. Thor, becoming a very popular Marvel character, of course, is very well heard of now. But essentially, there were hammer pendants created inspired by Thor's hammer, and at one point when they were particularly prevalent and worn by a large number of people widely across Scandinavia and amongst people of Norse faith, essentially it was a very powerful way to declare what you believed in, especially at a time when Christianity was on the rise. So essentially the Thor hammer pendants were a declaration of your faith as well as a symbol for protection, or a protective charm, if you like. So in Norse culture, you also had a beautiful armband, which was given, arm rings they were called, arm ring that was given by chieftains to their warriors, their loyal warriors. Again, a bit like the torques, these arm rings were gifted by a chieftain to a warrior as a declaration of the unending bond that now exists between the chieftain and the warrior, and oaths were sworn by them once again. So they weren't just a trophy or a prize that you received. It was a huge honor to receive one, and a huge commitment as well. In Norse and Scandinavian culture, you also had the tradition of burial jewelry. So, of course, you may be familiar with, for example, the Vikings and their burial practices. The individual who had passed away would be put on a ship or a vessel that would then be floated out. It could be a boat, a large boat, that was laden with all these goods, and be floated out and be set fire to with an arrow that was shot, that was of course alight, and that's essentially the burial. But on that vessel, and or in that burial practice, you didn't just have goods for the afterlife like clothing and food and weaponry. There was also jewelry, which essentially showed that jewelry was so deeply tied to a person and their identity that it actually traveled with them into the afterlife, essentially. And then some other examples of Norse and Scandinavian jewelry traditions include filigree jewelry, which of course the Scandinavian smiths in particular were very celebrated for their ability to be able to weave these beautifully intricate patterns with wire, with metal essentially. And what was fascinating about this particular form of jewelry making was that it was more a communication of the wealth of a community. So essentially, if a community could have a Scandinavian smith creating these beautiful filigree pieces of jewelry, how wealthy must that community be, is essentially what that was making a statement about. The filigree work was making a statement to say. So in Norse culture, you can see again how jewelry was not just something that was purely decorative. It was much more deeply personal, deeply meaningful to people than that. It was so deeply personal and meaningful, it traveled with you into the afterlife. It was a very strong visual way to communicate the bonds that exist between two people. That was the key thing with it, a very strong visual way to communicate the bonds that exist between two individuals. Now, fact number three, or moving on to region number three, I should say, looking at Mediterranean jewelry traditions. Of course, when it came to Mediterranean jewelry traditions, we're looking at the ancient Greek jewelry traditions, the ancient Roman jewelry traditions, and the Byzantine jewelry traditions. When it comes to the ancient Greek jewelry traditions, you may be familiar with the gold leaf wreaths or crowns, essentially, that were created They would look like a wreath and they were worn as a crown. They were given to people who had been victorious in, for example, the Olympic Games. So any kind of competitive sport where someone had emerged victorious, they would receive this crown to wear. There were also pieces of jewelry that were inspired by symbols that were associated with particular deities. So, for example, Aphrodite, she was associated with doves. So, doves would be in pieces of jewelry that were worn as a declaration of your devotion to Aphrodite. So, for them, wearing jewelry was not just about celebrating a person's success, but also about declaring um, your spiritual beliefs, and essentially an act of devotion in some ways. Amongst the Romans, however, it's fascinating to see the contrast. So, amongst the ancient Romans, jewelry traditions typically were focused around showing where you belonged within society. So, in essence, there was a social hierarchy, like a caste system, basically, and your jewelry would show where you belonged in this system. Young children would wear bulas, which were amulets, which would then be changed up when they entered adulthood for a ring worn around the neck. That would be made out of iron typically, but as you climb the social ranks, as it was, climb the social ladder, it would be made out of more and more and more expensive materials to communicate where you stood in society. So it's a form of labeling, essentially, in Roman society, labeling people according to a caste system, essentially. And then, of course, when it came to Byzantine goldwork, which is again fascinating, that was very much about devotion. It was a devotional art form. The enamel and goldwork jewelry that was produced was very heavy in imagery to do with Christianity. So essentially, these pieces were created as very strong acts of devotion to Christianity. So there we are. So we can see in this case, in the Mediterranean, a lot of jewelry traditions were not just in some cases and some areas a way of segregating people according to their social position, but it was also a way of communicating where you stood in relation to the universe, in your spiritual beliefs, and in the case of Greeks, for example, you communicating your affection towards certain deities, the existence of gods featured in your piece. So essentially, you were saying through your jewelry, I believe in the existence of gods above myself, who are bigger than me. I believe in the cosmos and the universe. That I am a human, I'm a mortal, but there are immortals. So essentially, you're communicating where you belonged in the universe. Um, Going on to number four, region number four, the Slavic and Eastern European jewelry traditions, which fascinatingly centered around women. And there were different jewelry traditions. For example, the temple rings, which I was not familiar with, but essentially rings worn around the temples, which I imagine are attached with an armband. So there's an armband to help them, focus on sitting on your temples. They would sit on the temples of the women who are wearing them, and these temple rings were very different in their style and the material from which they were made, depending on the region in which they were made. And so essentially, they acted a bit like a badge, or a bit like an ID badge or ID, passport. Essentially, through a woman's temple rings, just by looking at her temple rings, you could tell exactly what region she came from. Um, Moving on from that, we also had crescent moon pendants, which are called lanula. I may not be pronounced that correctly, but lanula, which are crescent moon pendants, and they obviously were very strongly connected to feminine energy, to beauty, to fertility, and to the cycles of the moon. So women would wear them at key points in their life, again for that connection to the moon, to the feminine energy, the celestial energy of the moon, and the feminine energy that is associated with. And then, of course, there were another example is colts. Now, colts were hollow pendant earrings. Fascinating. I'd never come across these before, but fascinatingly, they were hollow pendant earrings, and which contained essentially they were hollow because they were hollowed out because they were like a compartment, and in this hollow, they were filled with herbs or perfumes, sometimes a combination of both, essentially acting as healing, holistic medicine, at the same time as beauty, all in one pair of earrings. And then there was also embroidered jewelry beadwork as well. So a lot of this embroidery work involving beads across a lot of Eastern European cultures was a beautiful way to bridge the gap between clothing and adornment. So the pieces created were not strictly speaking necessarily jewelry, but the embroidered beadwork that was produced was so strikingly beautiful. It essentially was like jewelry, but jewelry in the form of clothing in some cases. So the gap between clothing and jewelry was essentially bridged in there through this particular tradition. So across some Slavic and Eastern European jewelry traditions, fascinatingly, the tradition centered more around the idea of mapping out a woman's life. Essentially, you could look at the jewelry that a woman has in her possession, and that jewelry acts as a roadmap of her life. And you could essentially, if you knew how to read it, tell everything, you discover everything you need to discover about this woman through her jewelry, essentially. Um, and region number 5, the final one that we're going to cover today, is the medieval jewelry traditions, of course, medieval European jewelry traditions. Now, there are a couple of fascinating ones. Poison rings, which I'm already familiar with, but let's go over that. Poison rings and lockets, locket rings. These were essentially rings that contained secret compartments in which you could hold love notes, love tokens, poison, medicines. In this case, jewelry was very functional. So jewelry is beautiful, but equally functional through this particular form of jewelry. They also created reliquary pendants. They were quite popular and common in medieval European times, and this was essentially jewelry that contained the relics of a saint or contained sacred earth, for example. And essentially, wearing these pendants was a way of wearing or carrying divine protection. Heraldic jewelry was another wonderful discovery for me when it comes to medieval European jewelry traditions. But heraldic jewelry is essentially livery collars and badges and brooches. These livery collars, badges, and brooches acted as flags. Essentially, they would communicate to other people who you swear allegiance to, who you're loyal to, which ruler you're loyal to. So essentially, like wearing a flag, as mentioned. And finally, guild made jewelry. Now, guilds were on the rise in this particular time, and as guilds rose, so did a lot of pieces of jewelry. Which were coming out of these guilds, but these jewelry pieces weren't just pieces of jewelry. They carried all of the merits, all of the worth, all of the reputation of the person who made these pieces of jewelry. Because essentially, before you could actually become um, an artisan recognized by the guild and able to create pieces on your own, you had to go through years of training as an apprentice, really rigorous, really strict training to learn the skills in a particular way so that you could actually master them to a level that would then mean that you're recognized as an artisan. So you can see in medieval European times, the jewelry traditions were very much around the idea of one piece of jewelry acting in many different ways. One piece of jewelry not only communicated your spirituality, your beliefs, it not only communicated your political views and beliefs, it not only was functional for you in your life, but it was also beautiful. So one piece did many things when it came to medieval times and their jewelry traditions. So the brilliant thing about all of these wonderful traditions that we have just uncovered is that jewelry always stood for something greater than just something you wear to beautify yourself. They stood for a meaning that carried far beyond the materials as well. That's an important one to remember. All these traditions show that jewelry was so much more than the material it was made out of, and it was so much more than just something you wore to make yourself look beautiful. It carried story. It was worn for protection. It was worn as a declaration of your political views, declaration of your spiritual beliefs. It was worn as a way of communicating your belonging, which community you belong to, which family you belong to, and also it was deeply tied to your identity as a person and the bonds you shared with other people around you. So when you think about jewelry that you own, or the jewelry that you desire, what is that jewelry, I'd like to ask you now, actually standing for? So when you think about the pieces of jewelry that already exist in your jewelry wardrobe and the pieces of jewelry you would like to own, what do those pieces of jewelry actually stand for? Because essentially, by investing in those pieces of jewelry and holding those pieces of jewelry and wearing those pieces of jewelry and keeping those pieces of jewelry in your jewelry wardrobe, you are essentially saying that you stand by and agree with whatever that jewelry stands for as well. And is it important for your jewelry to stand for something that is truly yours, that you truly feel in alignment with? Or is it okay for you to carry pieces of jewelry that perhaps carry stories or are essentially tied to ideas that you don't feel comfortable with? So I'd love to know your thoughts. And if you've enjoyed today's video, of course, please feel free to hit the thumbs up button. Feel free to subscribe if you wish to stick around and learn with me some more. I'm planning in my next part 2 of this video to look into the European jewelry traditions more from a view of the symbolism and the meaning behind them. Because today we almost just went across different regions, introduced a couple of the different jewelry traditions which existed covered over to some degree what the meaning behind those traditions was, but I feel like I need to dig a little bit deeper. So please do feel free to stick around and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can tell when my next video comes out. I produce one of these a week. Share any thoughts that came to mind, whether it's, A, the answer to the question I posed, or B, a fact that you found particularly fascinating, or C, perhaps information you have to share and add to the conversation. I would love to know. In the meantime, I will wish you a beautiful week ahead. I'll be back again soon. And remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought. Bye for now.